Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, The Federal Role in Preparing for, Responding to, and Mitigating Disasters. This is the first installment in a new ELI series entitled Agency ABCs, which will examine various federal agencies, their structures, and the services they provide. Today's webinar kicks the series off by focusing on FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. My name is Madison Calhoun, and I'm the Senior Manager of Educational Programs here at ELI. If you're not familiar with the Environmental Law Institute, we are an internationally recognized nonpartisan research, publishing, and education center working to strengthen environmental protection by improving law and governance worldwide. Thank you for joining today's program. We would like to also thank our wonderful expert speakers for taking the time out of their busy schedules to prepare a fantastic program for you all today. I just have a couple of quick logistical notes, and then I'll turn things over to our moderator. Today's event is being recorded. The recording will be uploaded to the event webpage and ELI's YouTube page within a few business days of the program. We will be saving time for audience questions at the end of the program, so please feel free to put your questions in Zoom's Q&A box as soon as you think of them. There's no need to wait until the end of the webinar. While the chat will also be open for you to post your observations throughout the program, please put any questions that you wish for our speakers to address in the Q&A box rather than in the chat. And with that, I will hand things over to today's wonderful moderator, Rebecca Kisslinger. Rebecca is the Senior Science and Policy Analyst at the Environmental Law Institute and Director of ELI's Wetlands Program. Rebecca conducts policy research on local, state, and federal wetlands law, policy and management. Rebecca also leads ELI's work on climate resilience and hazard mitigation. Her work is focused on advancing nature-based solutions by promoting partnerships among natural resources agencies and organizations and hazard mitigation planners. Rebecca, I will hand things over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Madison. Thank you all for being here. We're really happy to be having this webinar this morning or this afternoon. As Madison said, I'm Rebecca Kisslinger. I'm the Senior Science and Policy Analyst at ELI. I direct our Wetlands Program and help to lead our climate resilience work. I'm really happy to be here today with this exceptional panel to talk about the federal role for preparing for, responding to, and mitigating disasters, and specifically about the role of FEMA. So thank you all for being here. Thank you to the panelists. Today's webinar kicks off ELI's Agency ABC's webinar series, in which we're going to sort of dive in to explore the foundations and functions of a set of federal agencies, including starting today with FEMA. We think it's a really critical time to do this, to highlight the important role of the federal agencies, and to really have a discussion and highlight the importance of the established systems and norms within which those agencies operate. The set of federal agencies, the independent and administrative agencies, has grown and developed over time. There's lots of change over the history of our country as our economy has grown and as society has become more complex. And though the mission of the federal agencies is set by Congress, the policies they implement and the priorities that guide them are shaped by the administration. And so there's been significant changes, and they can change significantly over time. But the agencies function within an established system for decision-making that includes requirements for consideration of relevant information, transparency, consultation, and a commitment for relying on and investing in the development of scientific evidence and technological innovation. Meeting today's and tomorrow's challenges, which are significant, without a commitment to policymaking informed by information and expertise, through an accountable and mutually agreed upon process will be difficult. Good governance allows for change, and we see a lot of change in objectives and approach, but always through accountable processes and with the respect for the rule of law. And for over 50 years, ELI has worked to identify and advance effective approaches for today's and tomorrow's priority challenges. And so it's in this context that we're developing these series of webinars on federal agencies. And today, of course, we're starting with FEMA. The Federal Emergency Management Agency is currently housed within the Department of Homeland Security. Established in 1979, FEMA's mission is to help individuals and communities before, during, and after disasters. In the last few months, and really in the last few days, we've seen many significant changes or proposed changes to the operation of the agency, its priorities, its ability to coordinate with local and state decision makers, and perhaps most significantly, its ability to help mitigate the impacts of future disasters. With billion-dollar disasters reaching record highs, Coordinated and effective emergency management and disaster response is increasingly important and going to be increasingly important. And so we're really lucky today to have this panel of experts to talk from their perspectives and their local, state, and federal experiences about the functions and roles of FEMA, the importance of coordinated emergency management across all levels of government, and the many changes that are happening as we speak and how they will impact local and state decision-making, and the ability of the emergency management agencies to provide the public with disaster assistance. So we're going to start with Robin Keegan. She's a former Associate Administrator for Resilience at FEMA. She's going to kick us off with a bit of an overview of FEMA. She's going to talk from her experiences at the state and local level and discuss state and local and federal partnerships. Then we're going to hear from Chad Berginis, the Executive Director of the Association of State Floodplain Managers. He's going to talk more about the mitigation mission of FEMA, flood insurance, and some recent work they've been doing with NRDC. And then we're going to finish up with some comments from Rob Moore. He's the Director of Flooding Solutions and Environmental Health at the Natural Resources Defense Council. He's going to talk about some of the recent developments over the past few months, current events, and what that means for state and local governments. So we're going to start with remarks from each of our panelists. Then I have some moderator questions, and then we'll open it up to questions from you all in the audience. As Madison said, please go ahead and put those questions in as soon as you think of them into the Q&A box would be most helpful for me. So again, thank you for being here. We're really looking forward to hearing from our panel, and I'm going to turn it over to Robin to get us started.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. Just first, really wanted to say thank you to the Environmental Law Institute, and thank you again to Rebecca and Madison for your help in coordinating. This is a really timely session. I'm really thrilled about the entire series of webinars and look forward to dialing into them. And I'm really grateful that you've started with FEMA. As you mentioned, this is a really dynamic and challenging time. Just really quickly, as Rebecca mentioned, I come to this topic most recently, having served in the Biden-Harris administration as the Associate Administrator for Resilience at FEMA. I was also dual-hatted. I was the Deputy Secretary for Economic Development at HUD during this time as well, for about 3 years. And before that, I have about 2 decades in resilience and disaster recovery field, formerly a state leader in the state of Louisiana after Katrina and Rita, and many other disasters, in the nonprofit sector as well as in the private sector, helping state and local communities and residents stand up recovery programs and develop and implement resilience plans and projects. So again, this really is a dynamic and challenging time, and I want to make sure that we get time to both hear from my colleagues, but also to really have a rich dialogue. There's a lot to talk about, there's a lot to think about, and a lot to share. As we know that even as last Thursday and Friday, FEMA's role is in real time in flux. There's a lot of question marks about what FEMA's role is, what the purpose of FEMA is. At the same time, disasters are coming more frequently and getting more severe. And we're seeing more and more compounding disasters that are happening in our communities, even in places that have, until this point, not seen severe or catastrophic disasters. So again, before we dive into these pressing issues, I'm going to just give a very high-level, abridged version of FEMA's role, and then we'll look forward to Chad and Rob really rounding it out, and then look forward to our dialogue. As Rebecca mentioned, FEMA's mission is helping people before, during, and after disasters. The main role is defined in the Stafford Act, which is the statute that governs FEMA's actions and role. FEMA is authorized under the Stafford Act to coordinate the federal response and recovery processes in partnership with federal partner agencies and tasks those agencies with response and recovery actions as requested by state, local, or tribal governments. The Stafford Act also outlines what FEMA can and cannot pay for from the Disaster Recovery Fund, which is the governing fund for, or the fund for disaster recovery, response, and resilience and mitigation under FEMA. We'll talk a little bit more about funding later if we have time. So really, we'll just go to the main functions of FEMA, and we just really gave you, we're giving you, maybe next slide, gave you really just two simple pictures. So this one is really just to show that There are four main functions of emergency management, and really this is where FEMA work comes in. And then just to show that this is really, again, cyclical, that all of these pieces happen during each and every phase. So really critical. And I think if we go to the next slide, it'll be at least a little bit easier to see how this falls together. So before a disaster, there are major steps in preparedness in assessing a community's risk, in planning for a disaster, planning and understanding what hazards a community is facing and how to really prepare and to plan forward and invest both before a disaster as well as after disaster. And to insure against losses. So the National Flood Insurance Program is one of the largest insurance programs in the country, and it plays a pivotal role both before a disaster as well as during and after a disaster in making sure that communities and residents have the resources that they need in order to rebuild. And then if they are in a floodplain, there are other insurance programs that we can talk about later. And I know that Chad and Rob will pick up on some of those threads. And then really just investing in mitigation and in resilience. So in hardening systems, critical infrastructure, housing, the built environment, as well as our social and economic systems beforehand is one of the most critical steps that we can do in order to make sure that during and after a disaster, our communities can bounce back more quickly. There are a couple of other cross-cutting activities that are not on my slide, apologies, but they happen before, during, and after disaster, and they are really critical. One of those is really environmental protection and historic preservation. So making sure that as both in the before times in investing in mitigation and resilience investments, that we're looking again at risk and we're building for communities in the most safe and appropriate way given their natural systems and natural environments. And then also looking at historic preservation, making sure that we are taking stock of our cultural assets, our historic assets within communities so that they are shored up prior to a disaster and after a disaster that they are able to be restored to serve the important functions that they play in their communities. And then I'll just note that another piece, and Rebecca mentioned it briefly, that is a throughput is community engagement. And one of those, a core piece, in addition to that, is really tribal consultation. And making sure that we have that FEMA and the federal government has a vibrant and established communication with tribes so that they are able to lead and manage their own recovery and response, as well as their resilient building prior to a disaster. So as noted above, a core role that FEMA plays is coordinator. Partnerships are really a fundamental operating principle of FEMA's work. These partnerships are outlined in the National Response Framework as well as in the National Recovery Framework. These frameworks detail how state and local governments, the private sector, tribal governments, nonprofit organizations, as well as residents work together to respond to and build back stronger. As a real framing principle as well of FEMA's work is that all response and recovery is local. So states, locals, and tribal governments are and always have been in charge of their own response and recovery. FEMA engages upon request as a partner to supplement when asked. FEMA also oversees, as I noted previously, the interagency coordination. Currently, there are about 30 federal agencies that have a primary role in disaster response and recovery. Coordination of this large group of interagency partners happens through FEMA's Interagency Coordination Division, and these include agencies such as the Small Business Administration, the EPA, USDA, the Army Corps of Engineers, the Department of Commerce, NOAA, Department of Housing and Urban Development, transportation and the interior. And again, I mentioned 30. I did not read off 30. There are many more agencies that are part of this partnership. In addition to these governmental partners, voluntary aid organizations across the country in local communities, both national and local, are critical to all of these phases of the recovery process, as is the private sector. Both local small businesses as well as large corporations play a role not only in the recovery process, but really in the logistics and preparing for the response and recovery phases. And then certainly residents, our local citizens in every community play a critical role in preparedness of their own families and communities, as well as a key leader and beacon of recovery and response in their communities. So I'm going to just talk really quickly. I'm looking at Rebecca for a signal on time, but I'm going to talk really quickly just about the recovery and response process. But again, this is really high level. I took a quick peek at the participant list, and I think we have a lot of experts here. So I really, again, want to move quickly through this and then get to the topics at hand. So just again, the response and recovery framework, it's kind of like a sports team. So really what's important is preparedness, practice, and partnership. Knowing your roles and responsibility ahead of time, investing in the playing field are equally important. Again, states, local and tribal governments are the first string, and the FEMA is the bench. It's a pretty strong bench, but it really only is called up when the coach or the government calls on you. So response protocols are standardized. They're depending on the level of a disaster. Recovery protocols are also standardized. They are all defined within, as I mentioned, the response and recovery frameworks. And they're aligned in emergency support functions for the response protocols. These emergency support functions are aligned across and by sectors. So think health, economy, food systems, et cetera. And then recovery support functions are aligned similarly as the emergency support functions. And this is really the way that the alignment happens within each government level, so at the federal, state, local level, and tribal levels, but also across those levels. And it allows a much quicker coordination and a much quicker communication and identification of needs in real time in a response phase. Similarly, the recovery support functions are aligned, as I mentioned, similar to the emergency support functions. And again, this helps a quicker communication and alignment of recovery planning, as well as post-recovery identification of needs, and then the rebuilding process. So one of the things that I think everyone here knows is that capacity is a real issue in emergency management as well as in the recovery phase. A lot of communities across the country have an office of one. Some have a part-time or a volunteer emergency manager, excuse me. So at each level, state, county, municipal, tribal, there's an office or department dedicated to emergency management and initial recovery. And these emergency management offices typically have something akin to an emergency operations center. These are organized, again, as I mentioned, into the emergency support functions. The reason that I bring up this issue of capacity, and we'll talk more about it later, is that this is really where a lot of the communication that we've heard recently about states and locals taking on the responsibility for their recovery, really kind of emphasizing that again, that is the protocol. That is definitely the way that response and recovery happens and is intended to happen within the national framework, as well as within local and state and tribal frameworks. Often, those of you that are from local communities know that there are more emergencies that are handled than those that are handled at a federal level. Oftentimes, those emergencies are handled locally within a community or between the locality and their state counterparts. Often, local communities have agreements, mutual aid agreements with neighboring states and localities where they can share resources if they have reached their capacity and they need additional resources. And then if a disaster exceeds a state's capacity to respond, FEMA is called in to support. So really just understanding and overemphasizing that hierarchy of need is really when FEMA is brought in to support. Going to just skip really quickly just to say that in the last 20 years, there's been a greater emphasis from FEMA, the federal government, state, local, and tribal governments, as well as communities to end the cycle of rinse and repeat. There's been a greater investment before a disaster strikes in preparedness, knowing your risk, developing pre-disaster and hazard mitigation plans, ensuring property, and in the physical and socioeconomic resilience and mitigation that's proven to save lives, time, and money. Investment in resilience is shown to have a return on investment of $4 to $6 for each dollar invested. And when combined with offsetting the cost of response, that return on investment jumps up to $13 saved for each dollar invested. So hazard mitigation, the National Flood Insurance Program, the more recent Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, or BRIC program, are all examples of increased investment that FEMA has made recently in the last 10 to 20 years in communities to make sure that they are better prepared before the disaster and to make sure that it's easier to respond to and to recover from disasters. I'm going to talk real quickly about 3 things before I hand it over, but they're really quick. Just as a reminder, preparedness is everyone's responsibility, not just FEMA's. Resilience investments save time and money, but more importantly, they save lives. And lastly, FEMA's functions are critical. We already know what it feels like to have, we already know what it not feels like, what it is to not have a fully functioning federal response. And we don't really need to see this again. I'm from Louisiana. I started my my state service post Katrina and Rita here in Louisiana. FEMA is different for the better. The field is different than it was 20 years ago. We've grown together and we don't need to go backwards. So I know we'll pick up on those when we get together. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Robin. That was really great. Thank you for laying out that overview. I think the capacity issues are really important, and I know we're going to get there as we go along today. So thank you so much. And I'm going to turn it over to Chad to talk a little bit more about mitigation and insurance.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Rebecca. And again, if you'll pull up that slide too, that kind of talks about the life cycle. And I did see in the chat, I think somebody asked about if slides should be advancing, but I think as a panel, we kind of wanted to focus on that one particular slide, kind of showing some of the functions before a disaster and then during and after a disaster. Good afternoon, at least on the East Coast where I'm at, and good morning to the rest of you. I am Chad Berginnis. I'm Executive Director of the Association of State Floodplain Managers, and for the last 32 years or so, I have been working disasters. I come more from the practitioner background, was a local floodplain manager and a planning director. Also worked in the state of Ohio's Emergency Management Agency, where I administer the hazard mitigation programs for the state, including over several floods. And for about the last 12 years or so, I've been with the Association of State Floodplain Managers on staff. And while I'm going to focus primarily on the mitigation mission and the NFIP, I did want to build a little bit on a few of the remarks Robin said and go into some of the other aspects and some of the other elements of the disaster cycle and just give a few reflections based on my own experience and a couple highlights there. One of the elements of preparedness, I think, that's really important is that preparedness, yes, it's about planning, it's about analysis and everything, but also it's really about preparing on how to respond and recover from a disaster. The professionals in the field, especially at the local and state level, just like with almost any skill that you have, if you don't use it, you lose it. And so we use, for example, tools like tabletop exercises to do simulated responses and recoveries from disaster events. That way, one of the things that I've observed, especially after larger flood disasters, if a state hadn't experienced a disaster in, let's say, 5 or 10 years, one, great, consider yourself lucky. But two, we find that the recovery and even the mitigation piece tends to be a little bit more uneven. And again, I think part of that is due to the fact that there isn't maybe quite as much muscle memory in terms of being in the routine of okay, yes, this is how we do it. We have the relationships formed, and now we're going to have an effective and efficient recovery and mitigation piece that way. Also, I'd like to mention a little bit on response because this is an area that to my great discomfort, I think has been really, I think, misunderstood as well. And again, Robin had talked about this a little bit, but typically response is state and locally led. This is not a FEMA-led mission. FEMA is typically not in that first response role. Now, probably the big exception to this is when you have catastrophic events where essentially your capacity to do incident command has been almost entirely wiped out. And in that case, then an efficient and effective FEMA has got to be ready to be able to go into that response role until effective incident command can be reestablished by the state that can then be taken over, and then FEMA pulls back. But in most disaster events, and in my estimation, probably at least 75% even of the federally declared disaster declarations are what I would call garden variety disasters. Yes, they're big. Yes, they exceed state and local capacity, but they aren't so catastrophic that states can't be leading those with their local partners. And then finally, in the recovery space, I like to think of recovery as kind of sliced into two buckets here. Short-term recovery and long-term recovery. Think about it, I think about short-term recovery kind of like in an operating room, maybe after an emergency. Short-term recovery is simply stabilizing the patient. You know, what immediate repairs, what immediate kind of actions can be done to stabilize the situation. And then you transition into the longer-term recovery, where then the hazard mitigation programs really start to kick in. And it's really interesting because I think there's different opportunities and different perspectives, and also I think maybe a little bit of mythology along the way, and I hope to be able to dispel some of that as I talk about mitigation. So mitigation, this is where I've spent the focus of most of my career, and it's really interesting because I believe in the other slide that was shown, mitigation shows up before the disaster, but also after the disaster. And when you look at a life cycle like this, sometimes I've seen it where mitigation kind of circles the entire thing because mitigation is really done throughout the entire disaster life cycle. Now, this is kind of a trick question, but I'll ask it anyways, at least for you to think about, is practically speaking, when does it make the most sense to mitigate? And when I say mitigate, by the way, I want to make sure I'm clarifying. I consider this hazard mitigation. So it's mitigating against the hazard, not the same as climate mitigation that way. But when logically is the best time to mitigate existing at-risk stuff like a building, a lifeline, something like that? Well, logically, that would be before a disaster happens, right? Because then you're not expending the resources and the time and effort and everything to recover and repair and all those costs. However, what disaster researchers have shown is that as human beings, we are an irrational bunch of people. And as irrational people, we don't really categorize low frequency, high risk events very well. And so while the theory of mitigation lends itself to doing as much as you can pre-disaster, the reality of mitigation is that most of the time people and communities are open to the idea of mitigation right after the event. That's the time when, after all, life is upended anyways. And so people are open to probably significant decisions in that mitigation space that way. And so Rob, I know, who will be talking after me, is going to be talking, I think, a little bit more about mitigation planning, which is a pre-function. So I don't want to take away a lot of his thunder, but in the pre and post space, we have, with the FEMA programs over time, evolved to have a pretty robust set of grant programs to fund hazard mitigation activities, again, focused on individual businesses and homes, as well as lifelines that way. The oldest of the hazard mitigation programs is the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. It was established as part of the 1988 amendments to the Stafford Act. And it's the program that actually I like the most that way. One, because again, going back to that theory, it is the time when people are open to mitigation, one. But then secondly, this is really a state-led and state-administered program by and large that way. And so it is more, I think, sensitive to state hazard mitigation priorities, as well as being, the timelines are also driven really, if you're, as a state, if you are driven to get the money out the door as quickly as possible, you often have more influence than maybe over the pre-disaster mitigation programs. In pre-disaster mitigation space, we've had some programs that have evolved over time. After the 1994 flood insurance reform, National Flood Insurance Act reform, we had what's called the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program. Now, this is part of the NFIP itself. It's only for flood disasters, and the focus is to mitigate repetitive loss properties that way. Those have been repeated in flooding. Also, we had, after the Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000, I believe, the Pre-Disaster Mitigation Program, which was more of a general all hazards mitigation grant program that was pre-disaster. Then we had, then in 2018, after some of the reforms of the Stafford Act again, the Pre-Disaster Mitigation Program morphed into the BRIC program, or Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities. That way. And so that program shifted focus-wise into really more of infrastructure protection and that kind of orientation. So with this set of hazard mitigation programs, one of the things that's really nice is that you know, as communities and states are doing hazard mitigation planning and raising general awareness throughout the year, disaster, non-disaster times, we would have programs that could meet people, communities and people where they are, that, hey, during a sunny day, I still want to mitigate. We have some grant programs to do that. And then also things like the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, you know, after the disaster, that is available too. Now, both the BRIC program and the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program are formula funded. And so basically what that means is certain percentages of disaster costs are set aside, put into a bucket over here of funding, and then that is the funding that occurs. So on BRIC, it's more of kind of national disaster cost, whereas HMGP is tied to the individual state's disaster declaration that way. And these programs have been quite successful, I think. But let me talk. So I've said the word hazard mitigation about 1 million times already. Let me just describe briefly what I'm talking about here. So again, I'm a floodplain management professional, and so I know a lot of the options in the flood space more. But for flooding, for example, mitigating might be elevating a house, relocating a home or business, dry floodproofing a business, or it could be doing things like installing a stormwater management system for a repeatedly flooded subdivision. it also could be looking at retention or detention type structures, or even more recently, FEMA has gotten into working with dams or levees or those kinds of pieces that way. And so, for each hazard, you have your own set of hazard mitigation tools. For earthquake hazard, for example, you might be mitigating, building retrofits are often very common that way. And of course, wildfire, you typically are looking at fuels management as some mitigation ideas there too. So again, over time, since 1988, when the first hazard mitigation programs were created, up through 2025, we've had an evolving hazard mitigation role and function there. But, and I'm so glad Robin talked about this, what is the value proposition here of mitigation? So there have been a couple studies done, and the one that was cited for years and years was an older study around 2004 or so, 2005, that showed upwards, I think, to 8 to 1 on return on investment for every dollar invested, up to $8. But then that particular study was updated in around 2019, 2020. And again, as Robin correctly cited, $13, up to $13 in return for every dollar invested. Okay. I want you to think about that, okay? Because the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, and I'll pull that one out as an example, that accounts for 15% of most of FEMA's disaster cost is the formula, right? So you get that, you put it into HMGP. So if 15% of the disaster cost is used for mitigation, and you can get up to a 13 to 1 return on investment, you can essentially, with that pot of mitigation money, expect the total FEMA disaster cost to be pretty much paid for as a return on investment for doing mitigation. This is how valuable mitigation is, I think, as a value proposition to the nation. And I don't think that we look at it so holistically that way to get that, because it seems time and again, and some of this I think is historical, some of this is political, is that we would seem to rather spend money on simply doing disaster response, disaster recovery, rinse, repeat, disaster response, disaster recovery. And that cost is quickly getting to the point that it is unsustainable. Now, over time, one of the things I will say, though, with the hazard mitigation programs that we have to look at, and I am also excited, I think, about the prospect of maybe doing a little bit more analysis with FEMA when it comes to some of the programs and how we can make them more efficient and effective, is that mitigation programs have gotten very complex. It is, to me, I think it is an untenable approach when programs take 3 to 5 years to get actually implemented, dollars to do the mitigation from after a disaster that way. I think we should be aiming for something more in the neighborhood of 6 to 18 months afterwards to be able to do that. And I realize that is a huge change. But again, that is meeting people and businesses where they are so that they can get on with their lives there. Okay, so we have mitigation programs. They've gotten a little more complex, but there again, I would say that there's still an outstanding investment for the nation that we should continue to have. So one thing I will, and again, this is absolutely not meant to be a political commentary at all, versus the commentary of, as a strong believer in hazard mitigation, it has caused us a little bit of concern in terms of the BRIC program being paused or ceased. And I say ceased because it does still exist in law. BRIC program still exists in the Federal Stafford Act as a program. And then also, at least the rumors about possibly hazard mitigation not being declared with new disaster declarations going forward. I think those two items are of concern. And again, it's one of the things that as an organization, we'll continue to try to talk about the value proposition of hazard mitigation that way. So Now, people may not think of it as a hazard mitigation program, but I want to transition into one of my favorite programs in all the federal government, and that is the National Flood Insurance Program. Because I think it's a unique program. It is absolutely a hazard mitigation program at its core. And it is unique among federal government programs because it marries up 4 disparate kind of approaches into one consolidated program. So what are those 4 legs of the NFIP stool? Well, first of all is hazard identification. The hazard is flooding, and we've got to identify it. So the nation's flood maps have been developed as a result of the existence of the National Flood Insurance Program. In the country, we have about 1.1 million miles of stream, rivers, and coastlines that have been mapped. However, we have about 3.5 million miles of stream, rivers, and coastlines, so we actually haven't gotten the job done. That being said, it still is one of the world's largest collections of flood hazard data that we have out there. So you have a flood mapping function, leg 1 of the stool. Leg 2 is you have minimum building and land use requirements for any community that would like to participate in the NFIP. Now, NFIP participation is voluntary. I don't know if folks knew that or not. There are over 22,500 communities in the NFIP, and it's a voluntary program. However, if as a community you agree to join, then you must adopt a set of local floodplain management regulations and enforce those regulations. And then this program is a quid pro quo. And the third leg is that flood insurance is available to any location within that community. And so flood insurance being the third leg of the stool. The NFIP, as was said earlier, is one of the largest actually single line insurance, if it were an independent company in the US and almost even in the world. That way, it insures a lot. I believe over $1 trillion in property now is insured under the NFIP. And why do we have an NFIP? It was, after all, established in 1968. And, you know, some folks may say, and I've heard this argument, it's kind of ebbs and flows over time. It's like, well, why can't we just have private industry do it? Well, it was established in 1968 because private industry did not have the desire nor the capacity to fully insure flood risk across the nation. Flooding and flood-prone areas is a highly hazardous area. It has concentrated risk, and insurance companies have to be careful to make sure that risk is spread out across a larger geography. It kind of is a basic construct there that way. So in the 2010s, we've had a number of congressional reforms on the NFIP that has facilitated private sector interest. Whenever private sector wants to write private flood, it is easier to do. It is easier to do so now than it has been, I think, in the history of the program. Yet at the same time, the NFIP there is the backstop. So again, 3 legs of the stool so far. We have mapping, we have floodplain management regulations, we have insurance. The 4th leg of the stool is hazard mitigation. And hazard mitigation is done in the NFIP through the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program. I almost kind of call that FMA as kind of a cost containment program for the NFIP, because again, the priority in law is to focus on repetitively flooded structures or repetitive loss buildings. We have seen, and I remember back when I was a state mitigation officer in Ohio, our most severe repetitively flooded structure had something like 14 claims. And then finally, we were able to mitigate it through the FMA program that way. And so again, you have these 4 programs really, or these 4 legs working in concert with the NFIP. So I want to focus a little bit of time on the regulations piece because this is an area that has been pretty interesting. So while the NFIP was created in 1968, it really wasn't until this 1973 revision of the program that the first land use and building standards came out as part of the NFIP. Those 52-year-old regulations have largely been unchanged since that time. There have been a couple minor edits in the 1980s or so in terms of including concepts like substantial damage and substantial improvement, but by and large, they've remained the same. Think about how much the world has changed since then, right? I mean, and in floodplain management, we've learned a lot about managing flood risk. We also know that flood risk is no longer stationary. We used to have this construct that, okay, flood risk today is going to be the same as yesterday, is going to be similar to tomorrow. However, that is not the case with climate change. And also with just urbanization of watersheds. Those are the two primary factors that change flood risk over time in a particular geography. And so what has not kept up, though, are the floodplain management standards. And I think that's borne out by a couple things. One is that we had ASFPM done some research in 2015 and found that at least 61% of the population of the country lived in a community that had adopted at least one standard better than the NFIP minimums. Typically, the NFIP, for example, the basic required standard of the NFIP that most people know about is that you build the first or lowest floor of a building at or above the 100-year floodplain. And so communities would adopt something called a freeboard, which says you go above that. So our standards haven't really changed. The risk has changed, and we are getting our butts kicked in terms of disaster losses. Flood disaster losses in the United States now exceed $40 billion a year on average. We've been keeping track of those, but then the Congressional Budget Office came out with a report last fall that basically said from the last decade, it's been averaging about $46 billion a year. It is an unsustainable rate of increase. And in the flood regulation space, one of the things that I think it bears watching is a new national flood resilience standard. It came out of a consensus process in the document ASCE 24-24. And that updates, it is a reference standard that pretty radically transforms what our flood standards should be. And essentially, ASCE 24-24 basically says that for residential, commercial, industrial buildings, you need to be looking at the 500-year elevation as your construction level. And then for things like critical facilities, schools, hospitals, things like that, you should be looking at the 750 or 1,000-year level of protection that way. It has some other standards, including expanding the area which you would regulate floodplains out to the 500-year. But I would argue, as somebody that has been a practitioner in this field for 30-some years, what we're doing right now tied to the 100-year flood absolutely is not working, and it is not enough. And so we are super excited about ASCE 24-24. And interestingly, back in 2021, ASFPM and the Natural Resource Defense Council co-petitioned FEMA to update its minimum NFIP standards. FEMA granted the petition, and over the last couple of years have been going through kind of the federal process of how you do that, which kicks off usually with a request for information, gathering information from stakeholders, and that process hopefully will continue. So in the meantime, I'd like to raise the visibility of that new standard because I very strongly believe it is the right standard for the country, and we need to be doing something way better in terms of the NFIP minimums that way. So I think in closing for my part, the National Flood Insurance Program, again, there's been a lot of folks talking about how the NFIP, is, if the NFIP would just go away, there wouldn't be developing the 100-year floodplain, or it's got a lot of knocks on it. But I would argue that certainly from the standpoint of a flood survivor, people that have flood insurance do way better after a disaster than folks that don't, in terms of their recovery and holistic recovery. And two, by having losses basically going against insurance versus going against disaster assistance, it is a good proposition, value proposition for the taxpayer. So with that, I'll conclude and appreciate and look forward to the questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chad. That was really great. Thank you for giving such a great overview on two big topics, mitigation and insurance. We appreciate that. And I'm just going to hand it over to Rob now. He's going to talk more about some current events, which I am seeing in the Q&A people are interested in hearing. So thank you, Rob.
Great. Well, let me, I was going to also say a few words just about hazard mitigation planning. You want me to continue with that, Rebecca, or in the interest of time, do you want me to? Okay. So with hazard mitigation planning, so as you can tell from the comments of Robin and Chad, we are big fans on this panel of hazard mitigation activities. You know, if you can recognize a vulnerability you have to a known hazard or a potential future hazard and do something about it before it becomes a disaster, we're all better off with that course of action. And one of the things that starts that whole process off is hazard mitigation planning. So under the Stafford Act, both state governments and local governments are required to develop a hazard mitigation plan, which must be approved and meet with FEMA requirements that are defined in guidance. The whole point of a hazard mitigation plan, I would say, is one, we want to learn from the past disasters that have already exposed certain vulnerabilities. We want to be able to do better so that the next storm doesn't become a disaster. We also want to make sure through the planning process that we are thinking ahead and anticipating future disasters and how risks may change as development patterns change, and as Chad also said so well, as climate is changing the risks for all different types of natural hazards, from flooding to wildfire to extreme heat. You know, any number of issues are influenced by the trajectory of climate change, and that influence isn't a smooth, linear progression. You know, it can happen in fits and starts. A disaster that would have been way outside the realm of possibility suddenly becomes much more likely because of climate change. So hazard mitigation plannings really should be anticipating these types of events and then considering the actions that can be taken proactively to address those risks, mitigate them, and that can either be through changes in policy or practice at the local and state level, or it might even be implementation of a specific risk reduction project. So for flooding, for instance, it might be elevating several homes that have flooded repeatedly so that they don't flood again in the future. It could be something different for wildfire mitigation or for tornadoes, but there's usually some step we can take to strengthen a building code, retrofit an existing property, or even just build better in the future that can help mitigate those things. All of those things should be laid out in a hazard mitigation plan. It should also be noted that hazard mitigation plans are required in order to qualify to get hazard mitigation funding from FEMA and some other agencies. So if you do not have an approved hazard mitigation plan in your local community, or your state doesn't have an up-to-date hazard mitigation plan that's been approved by FEMA, you may find that you are ineligible for federal assistance for those activities. So it's really important to keep up to date with those. Some other agencies like HUD will also require adoption and maintenance of a hazard mitigation plan in order to qualify for some of their post-disaster funding through programs like the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Funds, which Congress occasionally makes available. So these are really important plans to be maintained. I would also just say these are actually really useful plans and chock full of information that can be useful to other planners, other agencies, people who just want to understand the risks that their communities face or have faced in the past. You know, these plans tend to have extensive records of past hazards and disasters that have affected a community and associated damages and loss of life. They provide a lot of valuable information on annualized average losses and some projection of how future risks may change. And they also contain detailed information in the appendices that can be very, very useful for a variety of purposes. So I would encourage anybody in a local or state government capacity, or if you're working on state or local government policies even, to refer to these on occasion, because they will give you a new insight into the potential risks your community is facing, the vulnerabilities that have already been identified, and the exposure that different parts of your community may have to these hazards right now and in the future. So with that, I'm going to pivot to talking about some of the things that have been making headlines over the last 3 months, really for all the wrong reasons, in my opinion, that the administration has been rolling out. And then we'll get to your questions after that. So I just want to preface this with I'm keeping this to the facts. This is not something that I'm going to try not to editorialize too much on this, but I'm just going to keep it to what's been reported and what we know has transpired over the last 3 months. I also just want to mention that what I'm about to present is it is not comprehensive. I'm hitting the highlights here. There's a lot of other things that I'm not going to go into because we don't have 2 or 3 more hours to do a detailed accounting of all of the things that have happened over the last 3 months. But with that, with all of those asterisks, let's jump right into it. So since taking office, the administration, as anybody who has a newspaper prescription or even a passing interest in things happening in DC and elsewhere know, lots of things are changing quite quickly in the federal government on an almost daily basis. And that is certainly true at FEMA. So since taking office on January 20th, we have lost about 2,000 full-time staff at FEMA out of a total full-time workforce of around 6,100 people. We have also, unknown to us, is exactly what's happened with the disaster workforce cadre, which is comprised of between 10 and 12,000 temporary or contractual employees who receive specialized training to deploy to disaster areas. So these are by and large, the people you see in the news wearing the blue FEMA windbreakers in the aftermath of a disaster. All of those, in fact, most of those are not permanent full-time FEMA staff, but they are trained staff who deploy for a disaster and to disaster areas to assist with the rebuilding and recovery efforts that happen. So we've lost a lot of people with a lot of knowledge and a lot of capacity at FEMA, which is quite worrying. On a more financial side, a lot of funding has either been delayed or completely eliminated right now. So as near as we can tell, about $3.6 billion in previously approved hazard mitigation grants through the BRIC program have been basically canceled. The only grants from BRIC that are continuing were those that were under contract and already underway. So if a community had not executed a contract and initiated the project and begun drawing down funds, that project is probably canceled. In addition to those funds, there are 23 states and the District of Columbia are pursuing litigation against the administration for essentially slow walking payment of other approved grants that work is already engaged on. This is not just for hazard mitigation grants, but also includes things like the Emergency Management Performance Grant Program, which is a direct capacity enhancement from the federal government to state and local governments. So funds that have been approved and authorized for work that has been going on over the last few years, suddenly states are having difficulty getting access to funds that they were freely available to draw down just 3 months ago. So both of those things are deeply, deeply troubling. All of these things have also impacted directly the capacity of local, state, and other federal agencies, emergency managers, and first responders. So slowing down funding has put some staff positions in those other offices and agencies at risk. That's very troubling. I would also point out that several things have been done that directly erode local and state capacity, both short-term and long-term. So FEMA has abruptly canceled all in-person classes for the Emergency Management Institute, where state and local officials are able to get specialized training in how to run effective and efficient emergency management programs. And also the National Fire Academy has shuttered its doors for the time being. It's the nation's only advanced level fire academy, and now we are preventing thousands of first responders from getting direct training at that facility. States have also been reporting difficulties in getting paid for FEMA grants, as I mentioned before, and these actually do support emergency management staff positions. I believe I saw stories directly from Michigan and New York City about the possibility of having to lay off emergency management staff at those agencies. And then also on the staffing and capacity front, I'll just mention that they're defunding the American Corps National Civilian Community Corps. This is a program that allowed young professionals at the beginning of their career to get their foot in the door in the emergency management and hazard mitigation space. Those cuts have cut off a very important, I think, career development pipeline for this field of practice and for resilience professionals more generally. So that's also a really huge loss that we're going to feel for years to come. Beyond that, the agency has also made decisions to, the administration has also made decisions to block implementation of legally adopted regulations that contribute to the nation's long-term resilience to climate change. Regulations adopted by FEMA to implement what's called the Federal Flood Risk Management Standard. A memo was issued, I believe, in March that basically said, we're not going to implement these. We're going to willfully ignore the regulations, and we're going to rely on one somewhat vague paragraph in the regulations to just simply not do them at all. That's also consistent with the administration's previous actions to rescind the executive order that directed all federal agencies to implement the same standard. That's the second time that President Trump has actually rescinded that executive order. If you have a bingo card where you're trying to keep track of these things, you can get double credit for that one, if that one happens to be on your card. There are also agencies, notably Department of Energy, we have found this morning, which are trying to repeal regulations that implement an earlier version of that flood protection standard that was put in place by President Carter in the 1970s. So lots and lots of things are going in exactly the wrong direction right now. But perhaps one of the changes that were made that we'll see in short order the effects of, or are already seeing the effects of, were some sudden changes communicated from FEMA to the Office of Management Budget about the criteria for declaring a federal disaster, and also the types of assistance that may no longer be available in the aftermath of a federally declared disaster, or at least, if available, may be significantly reduced or curtailed. So these were made, we were made aware of these in an April memo, which I believe is still not publicly posted on FEMA's website, but I'm sure if somebody wants to see it, we can pull a link up and provide you a publicly available link to that. But the changes that have been made are basically a couple of the economic metrics and financial metrics that FEMA relies upon to determine whether it will recommend that the president make a federal disaster declaration. They are increasing those by a factor of 4. That number is not based on any type of scientific assessment. It's more based on this kind of assessment, like what number feels right. So For you lawyers out there, I think the term might be arbitrary, but I'm not a lawyer, so I'm going to let the legal professionals deal with that. I'm also in danger of violating my no editorializing in this presentation either. But anyway, that is already affecting states. It looks like Arkansas was denied a disaster declaration, as was West Virginia, probably largely on this basis. I don't know that for a fact, but the refusals to those declarations has not been publicly documented. Also, hazard mitigation grant program funding, which used to be pretty much an automatic 15% of the two other main pots of disaster funding that were made available, public assistance and individual assistance. The total of those, we would take 15% of that number, and that's what states would have available for additional hazard mitigation grant program funds. Those are no longer going to be automatic. It is completely unclear what funds, if any, will be made available to state in that regards. Moreover, there will be no more cost shares offered over 75%. In rare instances, states would receive a 90% or even 100% cost share, so that there was much smaller or indeed no requirement. So for instance, for Puerto Rico, after Hurricane Maria, given the financial situation of Puerto Rico, allowances were made to waive some of that of the non-federal cost share requirements. Those will no longer be offered. All federal disaster declarations for winter weather and snowstorms, those will not be granted henceforth. So lay in some extra salt for your budget and maybe go invest in some snowplows, because there will be no more disasters declared for those types of events. Also, they are going to potentially halt or at least significantly diminish on-the-ground FEMA presence in helping individuals in the aftermath of disasters. So FEMA staff would typically go door to door to help inform people about the availability of disaster aid and how to apply for it. That is now going to be strictly a state function, it appears, and we will also be well, there are just many more things that I just don't have the time to get into, unfortunately. But suffice to say that we have gone backwards perhaps a decade or more on efforts to enhance climate resilience and effectively manage disasters. And while the emphasis of this has been on limiting federal financial exposure, or these have been discussed in terms of reforms, these are not reforms in that they are very carefully considered, nor do they really think through the ramifications for state and local governments. So with that, I'll wrap it up, and we can move on to questions.
Thank you so much, Rob. That was quite a list. And you didn't get even to the end. So thank you for doing that. It's really, I think, valuable to have that all in one place. And thank you to the rest of the panel. I have some questions, and we have lots of questions in the Q&A. So if folks in the audience have questions, please type those in. But I think I'm going to reorder my thoughts a little, just so we can sort of go off of that last bit, Robin, and ask the panel, of those changes, what's worrying you the most now? And I think even more specifically, where you think, and to a question we got in the Q&A, like where you think, local and state governments, should be most worried, or how they can be, on the flip side, how they can be preparing and modifying their resources to address those. So, throw that out. If anyone wants to take it first. Oh, Rob, you're on mute, I think.
I think the thing that troubles me the most is just the discarding of years of hard-won experience, expertise, and capacity. Just basically throwing it away, and with no replacement in sight. I think as far as what can local and state governments be doing, I think local and state governments need to be investing much more in these areas than they have in the past. Some states have very well-developed emergency management staffing and protocols. Some states, as Robin said earlier in the presentation, have an office of usually 1 or 2 people. And that's even more true at local governments. So we are going to see, I fear, during this upcoming hurricane season and spring, summer flood season and fall wildfire season, we'll see very graphically which states fall into those buckets of low capacity and high capacity, because they may very well find that they are increasingly on their own.
Yeah, and Rebecca, if I could add to that, you know, it almost becomes a circular logic because you know, FEMA hasn't always existed. I mean, it was created in 1979, I believe, and it was because the federal and state the state and local capacity simply wasn't enough. It was disorganized and it was inefficient, and so FEMA was created to create efficiencies in how we do this. I think it is unreasonable, for example, to expect every community or state to be able to manage all the way up through a catastrophic event. It is simply an inefficient approach that way. And I think the more disturbing part of some of these changes too is just the rapidity of doing it. I really do think, and people that have known me know that I'm an equal opportunity criticizer, and probably I am harshest on states because that's where I came from. And I think for too long, many states have just simply stood back and let FEMA do what it does. And so I do think, while Rob said, states and communities have to step up, but at the same time, I think reforms for FEMA need to be practical. They need to give an adequate timeline for implementation and need to incentivize to the extent that they can. Thank you.
Thanks, Trent.
Yeah, and I would just jump in really quickly, echoing this discussion, really just to say that, just echoing, I think, what Rob was saying, that the changes are insincere. These are not changes to make things better. These are just simply changes for other reasons, and maybe I won't editorialize, but they're not sincere. So they're not based in fact, they're not based in problems. To Chad's point, and I think to Rob's point, there are very, very well documented, well stated challenges that communities face. We have them in our chat here, with working with FEMA, with working with our federal disaster recovery system, with working with our resilience programs. The federal government has done a lot of work there. They've got pages and pages of requests for information. And I think that if you really want to take a sincere look at what the changes are that are needed, listening and coordinating with the state and local governments, with our residents, with our voluntary organizations, and come to some, protocols and some thoughtful changes that are needed. That isn't just for FEMA, that's for the whole federal disaster recovery system. I sit from a vantage point of having spent many years implementing HUD's Community Development Disaster Recovery program, which is, I haven't even said the right name and it's still too long. And there's a lot of, Rob mentioned it really quickly, but there's a problem. It doesn't have money sitting there that's automatic. And so then communities have to wait. So there's a lot of problems that we know, and there are a lot of changes that have been recommended that are very well thought out and could be brought to bear pretty quickly. And then I just think that the federal resources are catalytic in the FEMA system, especially, but in most federal investments. There is a required local match. Even if it's waived when there's a catastrophic investment, there's still local skin in the game in those catastrophic investments, even if we don't count it the right way or the same way that we count actual hard dollars. But FEMA resources, federal resources, are investments. They're catalytic, they're proof of concept, so that the private market can begin to catch up where it can. Sometimes it can't or won't. but it's part of that larger federal or larger governmental partnership that should work closely with the private sector in order to bring forward what these changes are and what these needs are for communities.
And Robin, and to a point that came in the Q&A, maybe you could illustrate that a little bit. You mentioned at the beginning in your experience post-Katrina and how things have changed over time. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that to the points you were just making and how those partnerships are important and how it brings local skin in the game. And if you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure, I think
experience there.
Yeah, I think to Rob's point and to Chad's points that we've talked about earlier, I think that what we saw with Katrina was I think a failure to plan and a failure to invest, but it was also a failure in response. And while I will give all due credit to the FEMA, HUD, and other federal partners that were on the ground, there was a misunderstanding of the magnitude of the disaster and what was happening on the ground because we didn't have a strong local, state, and federal chain of command that was really built and has been built much more effectively afterwards. There were politics in that as well, and we suffered in Louisiana from those politics. I will say, since I'm not a federal employee, and I'm actually not employed by anybody but myself right now, that there was also a federal infrastructure breach in those levees that has never been really addressed appropriately for what happened in that community. That said, I think that what we did see quickly, thankfully, is that we did have FEMA standing alongside us day in and day out in a tremendous posture once those first few days and first few weeks were over. And we still have FEMA here in Louisiana helping us to recover, and we learn side by side every day in terms of what's needed, but for all of these stages of the recovery and response process. So, I think just, again, we've said it a couple of times, but we don't need to move backwards. We have built a system that is not perfect. There is a lot of change that can happen, but we only do that better through collaboration and communication and partnership. And it takes all of the levers of government as well as the private sector, our local communities, our NGOs, and our residents to be working together to do that.
Thank you for that. So a question for you, Rob, in the Q&A about hazard mitigation planning. Sarah, we worked at ELI as well. They're wondering about the level of granularity that hazard mitigation planning can achieve, about what kinds of data might be most impactful, and then how individual vulnerabilities might be amplified through those kinds of planning and studies.
Yeah, I think these plans are not super granular. So it is not the norm that you would see a specific project described in depth and detail in one of these plans, for example. The data that they are based on can be fairly detailed, but again, I think, well, something I didn't say, but I will say right now, a lot of one shortcoming of the hazard mitigation planning process is it tends to rely heavily on data about damage to structures and property. And they don't tend to focus enough on impacts to public health or loss of life even, although they do a better job on loss of life than other types of chronic impacts. So I mention that because you'll see a lot in a hazard mitigation plan about hazards that cause physical damage. So floods, earthquakes, wildfires get a lot of attention. What gets less attention in a hazard mitigation plan are events that don't cause property damage. So droughts don't cause a lot of property damage, so we don't see a lot of discussion of those. Extreme heat events don't cause a tremendous amount of property damage. So those tend to also be underemphasized, but they do have huge impacts on what's happening in a community when those events are occurring. So yeah, they are not a panacea, but they are a very useful exercise to go through. Every community should go through the exercise of putting a hazard mitigation plan together and doing a very serious look forward. I think that look forward is becoming increasingly important. Without that look forward, you're kind of flying blind. If you don't anticipate a disaster, you can't very well. You're going to have a much harder time recovering from it and planning your post-disaster rebuilding efforts as well.
Yeah, any other thoughts, Chad or Robin? Okay, great. I'm going to go back to one of my questions, because I think in the spirit of these webinars that we're putting together on the agencies and the importance of these agencies and their coordination with state and local government, I'm wondering if maybe you all could talk about something, that FEMA does or used to do that might surprise people in the audience or the public, and that, we should talk about. If anyone wants to jump in on that one.
I mean, I think that, I think there is a lot that FEMA does that people don't probably know about. I know coming into FEMA after working with FEMA for, over 20 years, there were a lot of things like the earthquake great shakeout, which is a day where millions, 2 people maybe run that office. And I think millions of people jump onto, a day to recognize and to prepare for earthquakes. So that's just one example of, I won't say that it's a fun thing that FEMA does, but really an important preparedness that they have put a fun spin on to make sure that people are really grabbing attention and doing the work. But what I'll really say is that, the thing that we've talked a lot about is that the disinvestment in the funding that is so critical for resilience, BRIC, hazard mitigation, it will have a lasting effect. Again, those are catalytic investments. What people, I think, may or might not know, if there's anybody that's applied for a BRIC grant, they know this, but some may not. What we talked about before, there's a local share requirement on these funds, all of these funds. And so local communities have already invested in these funds. They've already worked really hard to figure out how to come up with the match, whether it's 10% or 25%. And so losing that 90% or 75% of funding is a significant loss to many projects that are already well underway. And I think that the private sector, there's an opportunity here, of course, that the private sector can come in and step up and capture some of this loss and maybe invest in some of this loss. These are proof of concept projects. These are things that eventually the private sector could and should start picking up, but it's not guaranteed and it's not going to happen overnight. There's a much different way that this could have happened than just turning off the funding if the goal was to have it taken over by other sources of funding. And then I think, I think that both Rob and Chad hit on this, and the removal of a focus on climate science, on the understanding of our future hazard because of climate change, the information, the investments are not keeping up with reality. And that leaves our communities at just a great peril of experiences that we have compounding disasters caused by climate change. They will continue to be caused by climate change. And we need a response framework and a recovery framework, as well as a mitigation and preparedness framework that are built on what's really happening in our communities. So.
Yeah, if I could maybe, I'll comment on a program and then I'll comment on kind of a function that way. I think one of the programs that a lot of people aren't aware of, but again, it is one that's kind of under threat right now too, is that FEMA runs the National Dam Safety Program. And there is a program that came along not too long ago, the High Hazard Dam Rehabilitation Program. And look, we have aging dam infrastructure through this country, and it is a super important program. And you know, that program has essentially, I think, has had funds reprogrammed or siphoned off. And I don't know if it's been totally defunded or not, but it is under threat for sure. But more importantly, from a function standpoint, and I'm going to keep beating this drum because I don't think very few people understand how dependent FEMA is on the science and research data from our science agencies. And that goes probably agency number one that we are super concerned with is NOAA, and it's multiple things at NOAA. When we activated our state EOC for an unfolding federal disaster, NOAA Weather Service forecasters were briefing twice a day and probably working a whole lot more hand in hand with FEMA being listening in on there, but state-led, helping us chart the course on how we're going to do recovery and even response. NOAA itself has a program called the National Water Model that is advancing predictive, flood stages and things. They're working on an essential thing when it comes to infrastructure called Atlas 15. The USGS Water Science Centers, their leases are being canceled, and they're the ones that are responsible for maintaining our stream gauges that gives us eyes and ears out in the country that way. And then finally, even within FEMA, there are certain data collection functions, probably something that nobody's heard about, are called mitigation assessment teams. These are teams that FEMA that goes out after a disaster event. And they are building sciences folks primarily, but they look at how did buildings perform in the face of a particular hazard and disaster event, and then they generate a report, and those findings actually become then some of the basis for thinking about how we upgrade our building codes. So I think the assault on science and data collection in particular is hugely problematic right now, and it's going to degrade every function that FEMA has that sits on top of that.
Rob?
I don't have a huge amount to add to what Robin and Chad said so well, but I would like to take a moment to read from a proclamation made last week by the president commemorating Hurricane Preparedness Week to maybe close this out. But in that proclamation, he said he was giving state and local authorities a more significant role in resilience, preparedness, and rapid response efforts, as if he is bestowing some great prize and resources to states to allow them to chart their own course. Unmentioned in that proclamation is what we've been talking about. Like, far from simply bestowing these things on local and state governments, this administration is essentially dumping disaster response on local and state governments without so much as a good luck.
Yep. And as we've talked about through the whole webinar, capacity is a big issue. Since we're almost at the end, and I'm sorry I didn't get to all the questions, but if we could do just really quickly, are there good examples out there to point to use as models? There was a couple of questions in the Q&A, and are there places where you think we can look to for model responses on mitigation or response?
Well, I think FEMA was a pretty good model on some level. There were a lot of good things there were always things that you could improve upon and reforms that were needed, but the model was essentially sound. Also, a last comment I'd like to make, I put in the comments in the chat, there is an open request for information right now that the administration has where they are seeking people's input on changes and reforms that could be made to FEMA. I would also offer that you should feel free to express your comments about the changes that have already happened. That comment period runs through Thursday, May 15th, and I would urge you to make your thoughts known.
Thanks.
Yeah, Rebecca, on models at the state and local level. So for example, the state of Colorado has an innovative wildfire mitigation tax credit. for mitigation measures you can do around your home or property on that way. So even things innovative like tax credits at the state level are good. States can establish their mitigation programs to complement FEMA's, and even at the local level. And I'll close with, I think it's the village of, or small city of South Holland, Illinois. They're a community in the Chicago metro area, about 25,000 people. They have their own local hazard mitigation program. They get some low-level flooding there. They give people up to $2,500 to install mitigation, and it's a refundable credit. So don't let the fact that you're a local dissuade you from establishing your own approaches and controlling your destiny.
Robin, anything to add?
I'm just thinking about another federal program that we had many years ago that was really funded out of a HUD program, but it was a National Disaster Resilience Competition. FEMA participated, EPA, all the federal agencies, but it was also a partnership with the Rockefeller Foundation. And out of that has really spurred a great number of examples, but also a community of resilience officers within states and local communities that have helped to take a lot of this learning forward in building resilience into communities. So again, just going back to federal investment catalyzes private investment, catalyzes growth in these communities. So.
Great. And I'm glad we were able to end on some of these good examples. And I see Madison, so I see we're at the end of our time, but I want to thank you all, the panel, Robin, Chad, and Rob. Thank you so much for joining us. This was really great information. Thank you to the participants for sticking around. And we will have another in this series of webinars on agency ABCs. The next one is on NOAA. So to your point, Chad, all the important information we're getting from NOAA. We'll do another similar webinar to this, and I think Madison in June is where we're looking. So please keep your ears open for that information as it comes out. So thank you all, and to Madison.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone. A massive thank you to our speakers for joining us today. Thank you to Robin, Chad, and Rob for your insightful presentations, as well as to Rebecca for your wonderful moderation. We so appreciate each of you taking the time to join us today. This webinar was recorded. The recording will be posted on the event webpage and the ELI YouTube page within a few business days. As I said at the beginning, and as Rebecca just said, this is the start of a brand new ELI series examining various U.S. federal agencies. The next session will be on NOAA, the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Registration is not yet open, but we encourage you to keep an eye on the series webpage as we hope that it will be open soon. For more information about the Environmental Law Institute, ELI membership, and all of our other ELI programming, we encourage you to check out eli.org. And with that, I will close today's webinar. Thank you all so much and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you again.